In these parts, once the merrymaking at Christmas and New Year is over, the next public holiday we have to look forward to is one called Family Day. Observed on the third Monday of February, it's a fairly new holiday, created largely to give people a holiday in February and to promote family values. Now, I'm not the sort to turn up my nose at an extra day off work, nor at a good celebration, but I typically don't pay much attention at all to Family Day. For one reason, I don't think it'll ever amount to much more than a day off. It's a non-organic change imposed on our tradition, without, it seems to me, sufficient reason for doing so. Its creators could have adopted and jury-rigged an existing observance in February that already means something to us. But they didn't. They instead pulled something out of thin air about something abstract. I expect Family Day to have about as little staying power as the French Revolution's cult of reason. And maybe there's some cynicism in me coming out as well. When people push a non-organic change like this, I find it's usually either to push an agenda or because the thing they're promoting is in serious trouble. But that's not the only reason I don't bother with Family Day. Another is that, well, I have some very conflicted feelings about family. This may be surprising, as we conservatives have long been associated with family values, so I should spell it out more fully. On one hand, I'm well aware of what family is at its best. It's got a lot to offer. It's the basic building block of society and fulfills some rather important functions. It provides its members with love, nurturing, a network of people there for each other, and a shelter for when life's billows blow our way. It gives us an economic foundation and an environment to raise kids in. It gives us roots and passes tradition and skills on to us. So, at its best, family can be very beneficial and meaningful indeed. That's what I myself aspire to in family. And if your family is that good, then I'm truly happy for you. But we don't always see this in family. I'm also well aware that there are cases where this ideal is a feel-good fantasy with little relation to reality. I think of cases where family life is characterized by rudeness, selfishness, carelessness, neglect, and even abuse. I think of cases where family means watching constant fighting, or being gaslit, micromanaged, or thwarted, or of having to stifle who we are. I think of families that have forgotten how to be family and just sit and exist together. None of these are unusual. I've observed them many times myself, and I've lost track of how many times I've watched such families and caught myself asking a fatal question. Why should they even bother with family? What's the point? Those three magic words, coming from people acting in good faith, should scare any friend of tradition or family. For yes, family and tradition do have authority, but that authority depends heavily on legitimacy, and this legitimacy is not unconditional. It depends heavily on family fulfilling the functions it's supposed to and being a meaningful, positive force in its members' lives. Where that fails to happen, that legitimacy is damaged, and family members may feel alienated and feel family isn't worth the price they're being asked to pay. If people are asking what the point is, we're already past the point where family's legitimacy is in deep trouble, if not already gone. If we're to recall people to family life, as I believe we must, we need to be painfully honest about how often family fails to live up to its ideal. We, of course, should promote this ideal, but we also need to provide mechanisms to deal with cases where family goes wrong. Sometimes this can be done within the boundaries of tradition and family, but sometimes it can't. And when it can't, it's better to bend to the tradition and let it evolve in response than for it to lose legitimacy as people are stuck in a toxic situation that only festers. As with family as a whole, so with that foundation of families, the romantic relationship. And so too with aspects of tradition shaping relationships in family. When any of these go wrong, we need mechanisms in place to make things as right as reasonably possible. And if part of the tradition needs to bend to preserve the health and legitimacy of the rest of it, so be it. Western tradition has long prescribed monogamy for relationships. There are reasons why tradition developed this way, which we ignore at our peril. So at first glance, it might seem that we on the right, who, unlike liberals and libertarians, see authority in tradition, could never accept alternatives to monogamy, not fixing what ain't broken and all that. But as seen in the last episode, there are loopholes which can justify even non-organic change to tradition. And the most surefire of these is where a change fixes a problem that threatens to break the tradition by damaging its ability to work or by creating a toxic environment that destroys its legitimacy. So finding cases of these problems involving monogamy should be the starting point for a conservative case for alternatives. But in looking for them, we need to anticipate and answer objections as far as reasonably possible. And unlike most poly advocates I've seen, to be mindful of how differently conservatives and liberals think. For any example, we need to show that reasonable people from both sides can reasonably agree, first, that it presents a problem, and second, that the way out is to bend on monogamy. Before considering cases that work as reason to bend on monogamy, let's first glance at arguments that don't work as more than supporting weight, which includes most arguments I've seen from poly advocates. First up is society's rates of marriage breakdown and infidelity. I think both sides can agree that these are a problem we need to address. But conservatives would be less ready than liberals to blame the problem on monogamy, whether as a design flaw or as something we just suck at. They see alternate explanations in poor compatibility, in individuals' misbehavior, and in radical individualism, all of which are known to lead to relationship failures. And they could argue that we should sufficiently account for these before tinkering with tradition. The process of disentangling and weighing all potential causes is messy, so let's sidestep that task and look for something a little more clear-cut. Then there's how the culture has shifted anyway, making room for non-monogamy and putting pressure on tradition regarding relationships. Both sides see this pressure, but many conservatives see this cultural shift as going in a very bad direction we need to oppose. They also note that much of the pressure to allow alternatives to monogamy comes either from cultures with a very different internal logic from ours, or from a political fringe that appears blind to society's well-being. They thus don't see bending on monogamy as part of the solution. Here, too, our princess is in another castle. What about cases where people feel alienated or out of place in a monogamous setting? Being one of these people, I have some sympathy here. I think it possible for informed people from both sides to ultimately reach consensus on some points, including A, that there's such a thing as a polyamorous sexual orientation, akin to a straight or gay orientation, B, that one's sexual orientation, whether over type or quantity of people one's able to form relationships with, is not a choice, C, that a mismatch between sexual orientation and a relationship situation one is in always leads to that relationship's inherent instability, and D, that setting relationships up to fail through inherent instability is not a family value. So we can grant that insisting that polyfolks stay in monogamous settings leads to instability, and that this is a problem. At first glance, it might seem that we solved the problem and that this gives us a case for bending on monogamy. But detractors can still raise two objections. One is how personal fulfillment, in love or otherwise, matters more in liberal than conservative ethics. The other is the concern some on the right have for arguments for change being a slippery slope to places we don't want to go. Some, for instance, voice this concern over gay marriage. Holding its legalization would open the door to similar acceptance of not just non-monogamy, but incest and pedophilia. Back when I was on the left, I scoffed at this argument. But that was before I saw many of the same arguments from sexual orientation and fulfillment and intimacy that worked for gay marriage being used in the same way by pedophile advocates and by such appalling cases as Desmond is Amazing and Lactatia. There's something valid and serious in that concern. It would be unwise to open that door or let pedophiles anywhere near their potential pool of preferred partners. Pedophilia is indeed a sexual orientation, but it's one that's a misfortune, not an argument to go against the norms. Is it possible to distinguish a non-monogamous orientation from a pedophilic one, or an inclination towards incest, so that it's justified to go along with non-monogamy but not the others, and so avoid the slippery slope? I think so, even leaving aside my disgust at pedophiles and at incest. And this distinction will give us our way forward. But some distinctions are stronger than others. Against incest, we can point to the bad genetic effects of inbreeding. This is valid, but it's weak as it only applies to those couples that reproduce. Against pedophilia, we can argue that kids aren't competent to consent to sexual or romantic interaction, and I agree with this. But the topic of the boundaries of valid consent is huge and nuanced, so that any objections over consent could easily distract us much too far from the matter at hand. I'm not at all convinced by claims that the sole or even main purpose of relationships and sex is reproduction, as they're not true. They beg the question of why we should always aim to fit a purpose, and they're not used consistently to also bash, say, elderly couples trying to marry. That a pedophilic relationship is always inherently unstable, based as it is on one party being in a temporary and ephemeral stage of life, is, I think, pretty persuasive. But all of these have the feel of a tacked-on rationalization to suspend an otherwise foundational logic of authenticity and fulfillment. And this foundation itself appears shaky and oversimplified in light of the challenge of pedophilia. I find it much safer and more consistent to base our judgment squarely on whether we need to bend on tradition, as heartless as this may appear at first glance. And here a sharp distinction emerges. I cannot for the life of me imagine a case where a partner's having reached puberty would cause problems at all, nor where a partner isn't closely related. I can imagine cases, indeed have seen some, where insisting on monogamy leads to problems, and herein lies the chink in monogamy's armor. Perhaps the most obvious source for these cases is in situations of relationship breakdown, as these have long put pressure on tradition. And here we need a brief tangent. As long as society's had marriage, it's had failed marriages whose members have been ready even to take matters into their own hands to escape. I know of cases of people deserting their spouses, moving away, and faking widowhood to start over. Of men selling their wives, much like Hardy's mayor of Casterbridge. Even of people murdering their spouses. Society's solution was once to become pretty heavy-handed to force such broken couples to stay together. But this came under pressure in the Romantic era, when love displaced economics as the primary basis of marriage, and it became possible to reject staying in a bad relationship on principle. The pressure became too much after the First World War, and tradition had to bend, allow easier divorce, and evolve in response. Our culture, apart from some highly religious groups operating under a different logic, has accepted that being stuck in a broken, acrimonious relationship is a toxic situation that can easily lead one to reject its legitimacy. Divorce or separation often remedies the problem. But opening the door to divorce and separation has also ushered in questions about what to do when separation is, for whatever reason, impossible or undesirable. Why might this happen? Perhaps the most straightforward reason is the heavy price of divorce. Far from being quick and painless, divorce and separation are one of the times we see people at their worst. They can lead to losing access to one's kids, losing everything financially, even having to fight false criminal allegations, especially if the breakup is acrimonious. This is especially true for men, as family courts are regularly biased against them. In this context, a broken relationship becomes a trap, and I can't glibly recommend separation if the price of leaving is as bad as that of staying. Karen Strawn discusses a correspondent of hers in such a situation. This man was married with a young child. He worked long hours at a job he hated so he could pay his mortgage, while his wife refused to work despite his urgings, and she put her foot down on downsizing to a cheaper house. The couple's relationship was effectively over, but the man knew he'd lose pretty much everything if they divorced. In distress, he confessed to Strawn that he was ready to cheat. His situation, with not seeing his child or having any intimacy with his wife anymore, had become too much for him. Another reason is where a mental health issue stands in the way of separation. People with depression or the like are not typically at their most rational, and even if a couple can't stand each other anymore, depression patients can sometimes still threaten suicide if their partners leave them. If the partner still cares about their suffering spouse, then that blackmail puts them in an impossible situation and forces a horrible choice. They can stay stuck in an acrimonious situation where the relationship is gone, keeping the spouse alive temporarily, but without relief until someone snaps. Or they can act in a way that would trigger the spouse's death. Yet another potential reason is where one spouse has a long drawn-out demise. A priest friend of mine relates such a case, and no, he isn't violating the secrets of the confessional in doing so. An older couple in his parish suddenly stopped attending. Months later, the priest ran into the man with a new woman while they were walking on the street. That night, the man called and told the priest what had happened. His wife had developed galloping Alzheimer's, going in 6 weeks from normal to not even knowing who he was, and she was now confined to a care home. He dearly loved her and visited her every day, but he knew the person she was had died in everything but her body. He told the priest it would have been easier had she completely died, as he could have cried at her grave and moved on. But as it was, he was stuck married to her husk of a body. His love meant divorce was off the table, so he had to endure the anguish as long as that husk lived. In the meantime, he still had needs and intimacy, despite the shame he felt about meeting them in the only possible way. There may be other potential reasons too. Whatever the case, these are problem situations that require a solution. Our tradition has begun to accept the need to remedy such cases over the divorce issue. So what should people in their shoes do? Leaving aside points on mental health, which I don't know enough about, I see 3 basic options. The first is to stay monogamously loyal, accepting the consequences of the marriage choice. I sometimes see fellow conservatives demand that people in such a situation suck it up and do just this. If they choose to do so, I won't stop them. But our culture has already rejected insistence on this option over divorce, apart from certain dogmatic groups. The very same underlying logic calling for a change is at work here too, and the fact that separation is now problematic doesn't change that. Further, as the divorce issue also tells us, we should never, ever underestimate human needs for intimacy, companionship, and a supportive environment. Our experience with the victims of bullying and the likes of Dr. Crippen should teach us that people can only go without these things for so long before tragedy happens. And setting ourselves up for such tragedy is not a family value. So we're back to legitimacy. In problem situations where a relationship has become a trap, the need is for a way out. If we respond to someone who's asking for help out of a toxic situation by finger-wagging or demanding they stay stuck in it, we're liable to be asked not only what the point is, but what bloody good we are. We thus can't expect them to be masochistic enough to grin and bear it. But the second choice, that of separation or divorce, is also a no-go. The problem here is precisely that this option has been cut off. Yet we should have no desire to let the situation fester until something snaps and tragedy happens. So that leaves only one other solution. Change the rules of the game. Let them relieve the pressure by finding the companionship and supportive environment that marriage is supposed to be. And since it can't be done by leaving, It has to be done by finding it in another relationship at the same time. I conclude that in such problem cases, we cannot avoid bending on monogamy to save the legitimacy of the rest of the traditional package on intimate relationships. This opens the door to non-monogamy in at least one set of circumstances, and to non-monogamy itself being moral in at least some cases. At this point, two objections may arise. One is that these cases are rather extreme. The other is an ethical concern. The non-monogamy arising naturally from these cases is a kind of cheating, which doesn't qualify as what most poly advocates endorse as ethical non-monogamy. Does this raise a problem for us? I actually don't think these cases are all that extreme, not with how common marriage failure is. But otherwise the objections are well taken. My answer is that one small hole in the armor is enough to tear it open. Recall that any tradition has an internal logic, and tweaking any aspect of it can cause a ripple effect of other changes throughout the culture. Part of why we on the right don't endorse such tweaks without good reason. The Romantic era's making love the basis of marriage triggered such a cascade of far-reaching cultural shifts. So did the American Revolution's discarding the crown. Bending on monogamy does the same. Let's explore how in a thought experiment. I don't know what Karen Strawn's correspondent ultimately did. But suppose, hypothetically, that he had cheated, and that in time he and the new woman became an established couple. Further suppose that after this, his relationship with his wife revived and was revitalized. He now has two relationships, one of which was only legitimized because the other was practically dead. That condition no longer holds, so is either of his relationships now immoral? Leaving his wife was already a non-starter, but even if she doesn't like the second relationship, rejecting its validity should make us uneasy. This is not a casual fling, it's an established relationship. And for a relationship that was previously kosher to suddenly be wrong, without any internal change, is unprecedented and flies in the face of loyalty to our loved ones. Discarding the second partner might please those who reject non-monogamy, but it also makes another tear in the tradition's logic in a way keeping the second partner does not. And besides, the point of a relationship isn't to please those outside it. Keeping the second partner opens up more questions. Even if the second relationship was legitimized by being started when the first was broken, the basis for its morality now has to change. So what makes it moral now? Being grandfathered in, or the love binding the couple together? And can we justify treating this man's second relationship, born out of relieving pressure from a broken marriage that could have otherwise overwhelmed him, as more valid than another man's second relationship, which always was based on love and openness to more connections, especially when the end result looks identical for both? My point is that even if our initial problem with monogamy were in something extreme, it inevitably leads to a domino effect of questions with implications well beyond the extremes. And just as with other social innovations, non-monogamy cannot help but take on a life of its own. It's because of this that common arguments for polyamory now start to take effect, such as the arguments from sexual orientation, from high marriage failure rates, from the rarity of perfect matches, and from the craving for variety and stimulation. These arguments fall in place precisely because of the domino effect. This, incidentally, doesn't happen for pedophilia, because that initial door setting all the dominoes in motion is never opened. The slippery slope has been avoided. With the door open to non-monogamy, strict insistence on monogamy will not work as a way forward. But neither will the chaos of anything goes. Going forward, what will determine the scope of non-monogamy's acceptability is not how closely it resembles monogamy, but our tradition's organic evolution as it interacts with and wrestles with non-monogamy. This will take time, and we cannot necessarily foresee the end result. What we can do is give some preliminary guidelines on ethics in non-monogamy. For there are many forms of non-monogamy to work with, not all equally good. And recall that change in tradition is best justified where it fixes a problem within the tradition and preserves the rest as far as reasonably possible. Applying this to non-monogamy, there are many things within our tradition I think wise to preserve as far as possible. And these shape the types of non-monogamy we should encourage or frown on. While we need to bend on implied exclusivity in committed relationships, I believe we should preserve committed, lasting, special relationships as companionship and the basis for families. I believe we should preserve honesty, trust, and good communication between partners. This rules out forms of non-monogamy that involve going behind a partner's back, unless there's a good reason, like relieving pressure from a defunct relationship one's stuck in. I believe we should preserve love and respect for one's partners. This rules out forms that involve imposing one's will on a partner. And I believe we need to preserve healthy environments for bringing children into the world and raising them. That still leaves a few potentially acceptable forms of non-monogamy. Which one we should pick depends on what we see as the core problem to be solved. Some see the problem as boredom or lack of stimulation. If these people were inclined to stick to one partner, they might support monogamish relationships, which are essentially monogamous but with partners having hall passes to step out under certain negotiated circumstances. Those who don't mind sharing a partner might support arrangements where they commit to one primary partner but casually date others. Others see the problem as insufficient sexual intimacy. They might support swinging, which keeps the single romantic relationship but allows recreational sex outside it. Others, myself included, see the problem as the single romantic relationship itself and the straitjacket that puts on romantic and emotional connections. This is the issue in my initial cases. These people are more likely to support polyamory. This is the form of non-monogamy I practice, and the one I believe we should pay most attention to. Let's be clear exactly what I'm arguing for. I'm arguing that polyamory is a moral and workable alternative to monogamy, full stop. I'm not arguing that everyone should be poly, or that any particular person should be. I'm not arguing that polyamory is the only ethical form of non-monogamy. I'm not arguing that those who see the key problem as a lack of stimulation or sexual intimacy are entirely wrong. There is an element of truth in their positions, and our motives often overlap to shape how people live polyamory in practice. We should have no problem with that. I'm not arguing for more radical changes. In this, I part ways with a number of people in the poly scene. Some poly folks see polyamory as part of giving the finger to traditional norms, and they include more radical innovations regarding love or social norms as part of a progressive attitude. But I see polyamory as a potential best solution to a problem in the traditional norms, and as such, I see little need to push further beyond normal organic development. Thus, I will not promote the likes of partible paternity or raising kids without gender. I don't believe in these things. I think they go too far. I'm also not arguing that every form of polyamory is equally good, and the reasons why should be apparent in due course. So, what is this thing called polyamory? The definition I use is pretty standard in the poly scene. Polyamory is having or being open to more than one committed relationship at the same time, with the full knowledge and consent of everyone involved. Polyamory is not random hookups. It is not swinging, which is about specifically sexual partners. It is not cheating, which we in the poly scene define to mean any sexual or romantic activity with third parties that violates the terms of a relationship agreement. Neither is polyamory an attack on the sanctity of marriage. Quite the opposite, in fact. I get tired of those invoking the sanctity of marriage. Granted that the sanctity foundation is important, but the institution of marriage has been in trouble for some time anyway. Polyamory is in many ways an effort to rebuild and revitalize relationships and family. We should welcome and applaud the intention behind any effort to do this. Even if poly folk turn out to be misguided, their hearts are in the right place. I also, as noted, find polyamory to be part of sexual orientation, just as much as monogamy and monogamish are, just as much as being straight or gay is. As such, some people naturally incline to polyamory and away from monogamy, some are naturally the reverse, and some could naturally go either way. This is one reason not everyone should pursue poly relationships. There are many folk for whom a poly environment would feel alien. It's similar for polyfolk, actually, whom I sometimes hear say they find a monogamous environment so stifling that they're dying inside. Some even feel this from an early age, even if they don't have words for it and only see monogamous role models around them. This was true for me. Even as a boy, it felt stifling and weird to be supposed to choose and love only one girl. Growing up, I tried to be monogamous, in part because I was told the deep relationships I want required that, in part because I didn't know any non-judgmental words for anything else. I found the words when I learned about polyamory. They matched how I felt all along, and it made total sense. It took a while to fully accept that I'm poly, but I don't see any going back now. A number of poly relationship models exist. By my observations, the most common in the West is that of a network, within which any individual can connect with and bond with one or more other individuals. Such a network is called a polycule. I consider the network model to be normative, but other models exist, such as the group marriage, where the relationship is with a group. We in the poly scene have quite a few aspects to our relationships with no monogamous equivalent, so it may be helpful to introduce some terms in our jargon that name them. Polycule is one. So is metamour, which is a partner's partner. The mutual partner of two metamours is called a hinge partner. There is a spectrum in how close one can be with one's metamours, ranging from kitchen table polyamory, in which metamours have close, intimate friendships and may even share a household together with their hinge partner, to parallel polyamory, in which metamours have no relationship and never interact. An open relationship is one which is open to additional partners, while a closed relationship is one which isn't. Now, at this point, a detractor may object. Even if we grant that we need to bend on monogamy in some bad relationships, and further grant that some people are naturally poly, surely, he might object, polyamory might only look good on paper? Might it in reality be only something that never works or always leads to bad consequences, pointing the way back to monogamy or perhaps monogamish? I think not. Even in a cursory answer, I can point to poly relationships I've observed working in practice. And I note that if problems do appear in poly settings, that doesn't undo the fact that problems also appear in monogamous settings. But to answer more fully, let's compare monogamous and poly relationships based on my own observations, and observe their strengths and weaknesses relative to each other. We'll observe what the specific issues to discuss are. That will take the rest of this episode. Then in the next, we'll look at precedents for polyamory in history to see how these and other aspects of polyamory have fared in practice. Before we delve into these issues, though, I'll lay out some assumptions I'm working from throughout our discussion. I assume that we in the poly community should ultimately aim not to break with or put down society's mainstream, but to gain acceptance as part of the mainstream. Linked to that, I assume that society's needs matter, including the need for families to be a good environment to potentially raise kids in. I assume that polyamory is the normative form of ethical non-monogamy, for I see an inherent instability in other forms. Any non-monogamous activity, suggested or explicit, with people outside a relationship can lead to connections with them, and in turn to developing feelings for them. When such feelings happen, and we can't control when they do, then there are only two ways to proceed. We could revert to monogamy by either abandoning the existing partner or clamping down on dealings with a new flame. Or we could move forward into polyamory. The latter may lead to heartbreak if done badly, but reverting to monogamy always leads to heartbreak. I assume that the normative form of polyamory is the network model, and that's primarily what I'll be talking about, but I'll have comments about other types too. I make no assumptions about a polycule's size, or whether any size is better than another, or whether a polycule is open to additional partners, or whether any of a polycule's bonds are formally recognized as marriages, or whether it's of the kitchen table variety. On sexual orientation, I assume that same-sex bonds are kosher, but heteronormativity is inevitable. Natural selection guarantees that. So I also assume that opposite-sex bonds are and will remain the majority and the norm. Linked to this, some in the poly scene and the broader left argue that sexual preferences are often the result of how we're socialized in childhood. Whether or not that's true, I part ways with these people in that, in light of Haidt's binding foundations, I assume that a degree of instilling norms through socialization is good, though it can be taken too far. I assume that it's a mistake to compare the worst of polyamory against the best of monogamy, or vice versa. Like must be compared to like, the best to the best, and the worst to the worst. Similarly, if a problem appears in polyamory, I assume that it's only relevant if polyamory itself can be shown to be the cause. So if a problem appears because people went into polyamory for bad reasons, or because they went about it in an immature or foolish way, or because of some other intervening factor, we can set that problem aside as immaterial unless the precedent gives us a reason otherwise. Thus, for instance, if a relationship fails because one partner declares they're poly in a relationship that was previously assumed to be monogamous, that relationship didn't fail because of polyamory. It failed because of a potential incompatibility, or because the relationship wasn't what they expected from it, or because the relationship agreement was damaged and perhaps unfixable. But this also cuts the other way. Thus, while polyfolk are, on average, better communicators about their needs and boundaries in a relationship than are the monogamous, that's because they have to have these conversations from the outset, while monogamous folk are often able to get away with many assumptions and coast along until a problem strikes. This benefit is not because of polyamory, but because of practice. Likewise, I assume that if a problem appears in polyamory, but either the same problem or a comparable one appears in monogamy, then that problem is also immaterial unless the precedent dictates otherwise. Thus, for instance, allegations of high failure rates for poly relationships don't mean much. Most monogamous relationships, after all, also end in failure before their participants connect with someone who fits with them. That about rounds out my assumptions. Let's now turn to some potential issues raised about polyamory. Perhaps the first issue to address is what many critics see as an elephant in the room, the charge that polycules are unstable, serving essentially as a way to transition from one monogamous relationship to another. By my observations, this is not the case. I don't deny that there are cases where this has happened, but I also know cases where a polycule is being perfectly stable. I also observe the same transitioning from one relationship to another in monogamous settings, the so-called serial monogamy, and for much the same reasons. And when a poly relationship does function as a transitional state, the real question is why. The reasons I see have nothing to do with polyamory itself. Sometimes it happens because they opened up a relationship they were bored with, or because they tend to get overly attached to one person, or because they had so little self-control that they got swept away by what we call new relationship energy at an existing partner's expense, or maybe something else. Whatever it is, it tells me more about the type of people involved or their reasons for trying polyamory than it does about polyamory per se. I set this objection aside as unfounded. The second cluster of issues to address deals with other concerns I often hear raised about polyamory, namely those on relations with metamors and on jealousy. There are several ways relations with one's metamors can develop, much depending on the type of individual one is, and the types of individuals the metamours are. For one, metamours are a kind of in-law, so we can relate to them in the same way. Just like with monogamous in-laws, metamour relationships can range from veiled hostility to intimate friendship. I believe the friendship to be best, and aim for precisely that in my relationships. But this friendship cannot be forced. Then there's compersion, another bit of poly jargon meaning the feeling of joy in response to someone else's happiness, including a partner's happiness with other partners. Yes, this exists, and it's not unusual in the poly world. I don't deny that jealousy also pops up quite frequently, and over the darndest things. Polyfolk have more opportunities for jealousy to arise than do the monogamous, with larger networks of lovers and metamours. But this is offset not just by many polyfolk's ability to feel compersion, but the fact that a polylover seeing someone else doesn't have the connotation of betrayal or abandonment that it has in monogamy. I myself find I get less jealous in a poly setting than in a monogamous one, and also less jealous over established metamours than over new ones. Further, I find that when I do feel jealous, that's often an indicator of an unknown quantity I need to find out, so I'm usually led to get to know the person I'm jealous of a little more and see why I'm feeling jealous. Jealousy can also be an indicator of an underlying tension that needs to be addressed. Dealing with jealousy is a balancing act. On one hand, we all know how we feel about people who are so jealous they become control freaks. At the same time, there is good reason for jealousy's presence and its roots in our evolutionary history. It has clear adaptive functions, including protecting pair bonds. I think jealousy may require a little more delicacy in poly settings than monogamous ones, more awareness of the unique settings in which it may arise, and more self-awareness on when one does feel jealous. But that's not a fatal objection, only something that comes with the territory. And the good news is, jealousy can be worked on and channeled in a mature manner. It can be directed into constructive behaviors, into improving ourselves and developing self-awareness, just as much as toward destructive behaviors. This applies in poly and monogamous settings both. Overall, I suggest that those who deal with jealousy the best are those best suited for polyamory. There's also something to be said for elective discomfort, a conscious choice to face greater amounts of something undesirable to become better or stronger in response. The Stoics did this, sometimes deliberately going hungry or cold to resist tendencies towards hedonism and to force themselves into a higher appreciation for life. I see no net benefit for either polyamory or monogamy here. In poly contexts, this can force people to face their insecurities, to improve themselves, and keep up their meeting market value. But in monogamous ones, it can hone self-discipline in focusing one's efforts on one person. We could really go either way with this one. A potential issue over jealousy and resentment may, though, arise when multiple members of a polycule want children. We run up against a biological limit here. One man can get as many women as he likes pregnant at once, but it's highly unusual for one woman to be pregnant with multiple men's children at once. So if two or more men want to have kids with the same woman, they have to plan and make compromises to an extent unseen in other setups. Again, this issue is not fatal, but it's something to watch out for. It's ameliorated, I think, when men also have multiple partners and don't have to put all their eggs in one basket. But this remains one issue I see over jealousy which we should look at closer in the precedent. The third matter to address is the spread of STDs. This is indeed more of an issue in a poly setting, especially one that's not closed to new partners. However, it's also on the poly community's radar more than the monogamous communities. Mechanisms have been evolving in the poly scene that help mitigate this concern, such as restrictions on whom one can be fluid bonded with, and insistence on new partners getting tested. This should be considered in a state of development. Still, the risk is much more easily remedied in polyamory than in swinging or hookups. I thus set this issue aside as immaterial. The fourth issue cluster to address is day-to-day life and relationships. Monogamous and poly relationships are really very similar. Neither is all about sex. Those primarily after sex could instead go into swinging, or friends with benefits, or sex work, or the porn industry. One goes into polyamory for other reasons. Neither is either type about cheating. In fact, the consequences for cheating can be worse in poly settings than monogamous ones, with multiple partners angry at you at once, and the bar to starting over that much higher as word spreads in the relatively small poly dating pool. Monogamy and poly relationships both involve the normal realities of household chores, arguments, and compromises. Indeed, poly relationships are more exacting in the negotiation, communication, and trust involved than are monogamous ones. But kitchen table poly does have a big benefit over finances. We're in a world now where the cost of living, especially in big cities, is increasingly out of reach for many singles and even couples. Where whole polycules can share a household, that reduces the overall burden on everyone in them, and indirectly, hopefully reducing housing prices in society at large by reducing demand. This is not the only difference between monogamous and poly relationships in this cluster. Another involves scheduling time for those you love. In polyamory, you have to make time and emotional effort for all of your partners. And there's always a point called polysaturation, beyond which taking a new partner always means sacrificing something you do care about, and beyond which there's no way to avoid stretching yourself and your relationships too thin. But this is an argument for discretion, for knowing oneself, and for good time management, not against polyamory per se. So I set this difference aside as immaterial. Another difference lies in how closely couples are intertwined. Members of a couple are individuals who could potentially live almost parallel lives, but they're also a couple which could act as a cohesive unit in decisions and functioning. So there's a spectrum from individualist to communalist ways of functioning, with autonomy and authenticity in tension with relationship stability. Monogamous couples have been traditionally expected to be at the communal end of the spectrum, with their stability as a goal. But this is not possible to the same extent in a poly setting, in which anyone may be in several couple units that must be balanced against each other. Significantly more autonomy has to come with multiple partners. This raises a question mark for me. Remember, I'm someone who believes in lasting relationships and the need for bonded pairs to act together, to raise offspring well and ensure society's health and continuance. Now, granted that a background cultural shift in the individualist direction has affected relationships of all types. Granted also that even in monogamy, merger into the couple is often an ideal that's not met. And also granted that polycules are capable of merging into a cohesively acting unit. So I believe this difference can be overcome. Still, it's fair to point it out. And I think the tension between family, requiring merger into a unit, and polyamory with its higher autonomy should be explored further in the precedent. The fifth cluster of issues to address lies in the mechanics of finding and keeping partners. In some ways, monogamous and poly relationships have little difference. Relationships form around a connection between people in both cases. They also depend on standards one expects in partners. Here, polyamory, at least at the network variety, boasts a benefit, that a potential partner doesn't have to fit you perfectly in every aspect. This doesn't imply abandoning standards, only that standards don't need to be quite so exacting in a poly setting. After all, polyamory allows you to find fulfillment of different needs in different people, and to find a spark in one relationship that can spice up things in another. This benefit is nothing to sneeze at, but things could still go wrong. I'm sure to annoy many people as I bring up female hypergamy. I have mixed feelings about this phenomenon. On one hand, I get the need to ensure partners are good and meet reasonable standards, and I believe in improving ourselves and being the best we can be. Hypergamy is a valuable motivating force to this end. but it can also go too far and lead people to be too picky in an age where technology has dramatically increased our pools of potential matches. And hypergamy interacts with different relationship formats in different ways. Monogamy, by insisting on exclusivity, takes the top men off the market quickly, so most women have little choice but to look beyond the top tier. In polygamy, by contrast, well, at least the one man, many woman variety called polygyny, the top men are not so easily taken off the market, while women are, and women don't have to broaden their search as quickly. Fewer worthy people are thus able to find stable relationships. I expect the effects on network poly to be more complex. On one hand, women aren't taken off the market so easily, and without the ideal of the one, you don't have the pressure to find someone who fits you in every respect, and neither do potential partners. This is different from either monogamy or polygyny, and gives less honed individuals more of a chance. Further, with a number of men who aren't comfortable with their partners seeing other people, poly women often have more trouble finding men they like in their dating pool, again giving less honed men more of a chance. But on the other hand, hypergamy works best when there are checks on it, and in polyamory it's difficult to see what the checks are, other than the top men being polysaturated. I can see network poly developing similar to polygyny, with the top men and women dating and still leaving less fortunate men behind. This may in fact be playing out, for as Page Turner notes, in the game of poly, straight male is basically the hardest setting you can play on. And don't get me wrong, I'm fine with getting many men to improve their characters and their social skills. What I'm not fine with is the possibility of a class of men shut out of the dating market with little hope for love, whose hopelessness can lead them to tragedy, to resentment, or to rebellion as they reject the legitimacy of our system of dating and consent. We don't need that instability, especially if polyamory ever becomes more mainstream and scales up from a small subculture to a larger, even dominant part of society. So we should check how hypergamy plays out in the precedent, and look for checks on it beyond the small size of the poly dating pool. Regarding expectations on our partners, I don't see either monogamy or polyamory as having an edge. Expecting a partner or their choices to mold themselves to you in either setting is a mistake reflecting immaturity and little more. While some poly relationships fail, even spectacularly, I see little to indicate that they're significantly different from monogamous ones in this. And as already hinted at, I see many of those that failed doing so because they were started for the wrong reasons. Perhaps as a way to legitimize cheating, or to rescue a monogamous relationship that's in trouble, or to pursue sex and little more, or to taste a novelty factor or forbidden fruit. Other relationships have insufficient common ground to keep them intact. Other poly relationships do exist for the right reasons, and they last far better. I see no material difference between monogamy and polyamory here. Nor do I see a material difference over relationship game changers, meaning those things that come along and cause us to rethink a relationship or even our course in life. These are always disruptive, and there's little one can do against them. And frankly, they come with the territory whenever we open our heart to someone. Many can happen in any type of relationship. For instance, elder care, death in the family, an accident, a promotion, an affair, a baby, or a change in maturity level. Poly-specific ones may include new potential partners through raising the bar of expectations, or a veto on a desired relationship, or a connection or dysfunction, or something else. They also include new metamors triggering similar feelings in a partner. A poly setting may have more particular circumstances that can trigger game changers, and the effects spread more into our circle of loves. However, I see no compelling reason to treat these game changers as qualitatively different from non-romantic ones, or from those that also apply in monogamous settings. The sixth cluster of issues relates to raising kids. and this is one a lot of detractors latch onto. I've seen a number of fellow conservatives claim that poly settings are statistically more abusive than monogamous ones when non-biological parents are involved, but I think we can safely dismiss that claim. For one reason, these detractors are not consistent. This claim could just as easily be used to attack step-parents or adoptive parents, but I've never seen them do that. They give the impression of mudslinging at an ideological boogeyman rather than honestly evaluating arguments. Linked to this, I've yet to see them produce research beyond opinion pieces from biased think tanks. Those with actual experience with abuse victims tell us a rather different story. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, for one, notes on its website that, and I quote, "Abuse can happen in any relationship. A polyamorous relationship is not any more likely to be abusive than a monogamous one." End of quote. In other words, it's not the poly causing abuse, it's abusive people exploiting relationship dynamic situations. We can also blame those enabling abuse, bad power dynamics, and stressors such as social rejection. But these things also appear in monogamous settings. I see no material difference here. All this said, the parenting model we use for raising kids is a valid issue, and I don't believe that all options are equally good. Here again, we have to consider how we deviate from existing tradition. We can expect some ripple effects from polyamory's existence, but additional tears in the cultural fabric need to be justified. The most natural modification from the monogamous model is to continue to have two primary parents, with metamors being more like step-parents or aunts or uncles, perhaps though not necessarily in a communal setting. Going beyond this to more than two primary parents seems risky, and that this tampers with our tradition's fabric beyond any clear need is alone sufficient reason to reject doing this. But if we stick to the two primary parent model, that seems practical and comfortable, and I see no reason not to set the matter aside as immaterial. Then there's the issue of poly household stability relative to monogamous ones. We've already touched on this, but I doubt they'd be significantly different, as it would largely depend on the parents' relationship with each other that the kids see, though I'd need to observe more poly families with kids to know personally. And another issue is cases of unknown paternity. Even with unplanned pregnancies in a poly setting, the pool of candidates for a child's father is small and easy to test to narrow further. I think issues of children can be dismissed as immaterial unless further concerns arise from the precedent. Let's finish this section with some miscellaneous issues that don't fit nicely into any cluster. Regarding breakups, poly relationships have an advantage in providing a larger network of support, but a disadvantage in that a breakup involves not just the broken couple, but a larger network of relations with metamors and beyond, and the breakup triggers ripples of uncertainty and ambiguity throughout all one's relationships. I see no net benefit either way, so I set this issue aside as immaterial. Regarding the law, it's unfortunate and concerning that the law indeed presumes monogamy at present. Some issues this leads to are fairly easy to resolve, such as through having a will and a power of attorney. Incidentally, I believe everyone should have a will and power of attorney, whether they're monogamous or poly, as your loved ones can only benefit from your leaving clear instructions and reducing the opportunity for fighting and resentment. But other issues such as inheritance taxes on partners not recognized as spouses and legal rights involving children, these are more difficult and currently often require convoluted and senseless approaches to deal with it all. Still, I set legal issues aside as immaterial. For if the culture changes, then much has happened over gay marriage. That will put pressure on the law to change with it. The final issue I'll address here is that a society's institutions cannot be separated from the culture or subculture upholding them, as they conform to the culture's internal logic. So, is it of significance that network polyamory is closely associated with a branch of the left questing for the so-called social justice and ever more self-expression? That leaves me a little uncomfortable, not just because of the small number of fellow conservatives who'd be happy in that environment, but because it'd be wise to ensure polyamory is compatible with social conditions that ensure a healthy, robust society, not just those that one side likes. We'll need to see how this concern plays out in the precedent. That about rounds out the issues I see as material to the question of polyamory's social consequences, based only on an abstract comparison of monogamy and polyamory. In the next and final episode, we turn to examine concrete precedent, paying closest attention to the question marks and concerns I've noted, but giving due consideration to new issues that may arise as well. So, join me in that episode, and let's continue the conversation.